In this video, we will see how to configure and install the TXIO transmitter. As a reminder, the TXIO has 2 inputs and 4 controllable relay outputs. The TXIO transmitter is used in endless proprietary low-raw mode. It can be used in 3 distinct modes which are configurable from the server embedded in the transmitter. We will start with the remote control mode, where the TXIO transmitter reports the status of its inputs to the receiver and controls its outputs on receiver commands. Next, we will configure the TXIO in local control mode, where it controls its outputs according to the input status and sends reporting messages to the receiver. We will end with the D2D mode, device to device, where the TXIO dialogues with a maximum of 4 low-raw endless sensors and controls its outputs according to the alarm thresholds configured on the transmitters. For information, the TXIO is delivered ready to be used in remote control mode. Here we go. Let's start with remote control mode. In remote control mode, configuration is done from the server embedded in the receiver with which the TXIO transmitter will communicate. All configuration in remote control mode will be done from the server embedded in the receiver with which the TXIO transmitter will communicate. In order to access the receiver's server, you must power the receiver between 7.5 and 24 volts DC, then connect it to your PC via Ethernet with a RJ45 cable. Don't forget also to connect a long-range antenna to your receiver. We will now be able to move on to the product configuration phase. Once your receiver is powered and connected to your PC, we will configure the IP settings of the PC to access the configuration server. The IP settings configured in this example correspond to the IP settings that allow access to the server with its default IP address. The default address of the receiver is 192.168.77.77. From your browser, you will access the receiver's server. From the advanced settings of the RX config tab, we will modify the default address of the receiver's server to an address that suits us better. Don't forget to save the changes and restart the receiver by clicking on Reboot to allow the receiver to accept the new address. We will then modify the Ethernet settings to match the new IP address we have just configured. Please remember to systematically adapt your Ethernet settings whenever you change the IP address. We can now access the receiver's server with the new address we configured: 192.168.1.79. We will now be able to declare our TXIO transmitter, which will be paired with the receiver in remote control mode. From the Add Sensor button in the TX config tab, select the TXIO 600-040 and enter its parameters, its low-raw ID, its location, and its transmission periodicity. Once we have configured the TXIO and clicked on Save, it will appear as a classic transmitter on the TX config page. Activation of the TXIO is done by supplying it between 7.5 and 24 volts DC, like the receiver power supply. In the TX config tab, refresh your browser page. A green validation badge should appear in front of the TXIO that you have just activated. In the Network tab, the frames containing the content of the values reported by the TXIO that you have just activated must be received at the periodicity that has been configured. This tab allows you to validate the correct reception of frames from the TXIO and to validate that the RSSI levels for receiving frames are good. Moving on to the Modbus tab. When you select the TXIO on the left of the screen, the registers in which its information are reported are displayed in the Modbus table. We will now show you how to write to the TXIO relays, i.e. registers 17, 18, 19, and 20 in this example, to activate them. To write in these registers, we will use Modbus Poll Simulator. By clicking on Connect, we can connect to the receiver via TCP/IP. To read the Modbus table, we must enter the Modbus identifier of the receiver and the address from which we read the registers. These two settings are available on the General tab of the receiver's RX config page. Now the Modbus table is read correctly from Modbus Pole Simulator. To write to the 4 registers mentioned above, we will use the write multiple coils function. The identifier is that of the receiver, and the address corresponds to the address of the first register from which we wish to write. Now we can activate the coils and click Send. The OK response message validates that the command to activate the 4 relays has been sent. For information, the minimum delay between sending 2 commands to the TXIO is 2 seconds. If you send a second command before this 2-second delay, it will not be taken into account by the TXIO. On the Modbus table, we can see that registers 17, 18, 19, and 20 have values equal to 1, meaning that the 4 relays of the TXIO have been activated. We can also confirm the reporting of the same data and status of inputs and outputs from the TXIO to its server. Access to its web interface, as well as the change of IP address, is done in the same way as for the receiver. On the TXIO status page, we can check the status of the inputs. The status of the outputs that we have just activated are on, confirming the activation of the relays. For information, you can test the status of the relay by clicking on the toggle relay button. The relay activates for 1 second. We will now move on to local control mode. Now, let's see how to configure the product in local control mode. In local control mode, the TXIO controls its outputs according to the state of its inputs and sends reporting messages to the receiver. Configuration in local control mode is carried out from the server embedded in the TXIO. The procedure for accessing the TXIO configuration server is identical to that of the receiver, as explained at the beginning of this video. Select local control mode from the TXIO config interface. Configure your relays by selecting for each relay the input channel, 1 or 2, the relay mode, normally closed or normally open, and the delay, then click Save. Restart your TXIO so that the mode change is taken into account using the Reboot button from the TXIO Server Admin tab. We will now configure the TXIO from the receiver server. From the Add Sensor button in the TX Config tab, select the TXIO, fill in its parameters, and click Save. Activation of the TXIO is done by supplying it between 7.5 and 24 volts DC. A green validation badge should appear in front of the TXIO that you have just activated. In the Network tab, the frames containing the content of the values reported by the TXIO must be received at the periodicity that has been configured. Click on the Modbus tab. When you select the TXIO on the left of the screen, the registers in which its information are reported are displayed in the Modbus table. From the TXIO server, you can confirm the status of the digital inputs and the counts since power up. At the bottom of the tab, you can see the relay status display on or of and the number of times the status has been switched from the TXIO power supply. We now move to D2D mode. Now let's see how to configure the TXIO in D2D mode. Configuration in D2D mode is carried out from the server embedded in the TXIO. The procedure for accessing the TXIO configuration server is identical to that of the receiver, as explained at the beginning of this video. Select the D2D operating mode, then restart your TXIO so that the mode change is taken into account using the Reboot button from the TXIO Server Admin tab. In the D2D Config tab, from the Add TX button, we configure the first transmitter. Please enter the following parameters: its low raw identifier, its location, and its periodicity. By clicking on Advanced, you can configure the alarm thresholds like the temperature thresholds in this case. By clicking on Save, the transmitter appears in the D2D Config tab. We can now configure a second transmitter. In the same way as for the first transmitter, we enter its configuration parameters. From the advanced settings, we configure the alarm thresholds, then we click on Save. In the TXIO config tab, relays can be associated with alarm thresholds of the transmitters that we have just configured. To do this, for each relay select the ID of the configured transmitter, the mode of the relay, and the type of alarm to trigger a relay. Then click on Save. The transmitters are activated by connecting the battery. A green validation badge should appear in front of the transmitters you have just activated. In the status page, the frames containing the content of the values reported by the transmitters that you have just activated must be received at the periodicity that has been configured. We can observe that at the TXIO outputs, the relays were activated following the triggering of the alarms. Congratulations! You have successfully completed your first installation of TXIO.